So today we're going to revisit one of our old topics from a few weeks ago, which is state. And we're going to talk about how do you think about managing state when it starts to become very complex. You might have already experienced this to some extent as you're working through your Vue application, but you can pretty quickly end up having, 5, 10 different state variables in a component, and it can become a bit chaotic to manage all of that. And so there's a couple of different techniques that we're going to talk about, which are sort of built into React to help start to manage some of these more complex state situations. All right, so I'm going to try to split this up conceptually into two pieces as well. And in terms of why do we think about using these two specific tools for managing state. So the first thing, the kind of first direction of complexity that you might think about is I have a component. I have like 5 or 10 different state variables in this component, and that's just a lot of variables flying around, right? So something like, let's say on the left-hand side of this slide here, right? In this case, only 3 variables here that we have set up for state, but you know, you can easily get to 10, 20 plus in the component, depending on how complex it is. So at some point you might say, okay, I need like a better way to manage this, right? Because right now there's a lot of things flying around all over the place. So, and also, by the way, like you're repeating a lot of code, right? Because you keep saying like, use state everywhere. And, you know, it gets very repetitive. So the first order of a solution to this, which you might think about is, well, let's just combine all these state, instead of having 3 separate state variables, let's combine them into a single state object that has different properties assigned to these 3 variables. So that's what this middle chart is showing, right? Which is you have a single use state, and the state itself is an object which has different properties, which correspond to the separate state variables we had before. And then you can just work with it as a single state object everywhere that you want. So that removes one layer of complexity, which is now I only have to worry about one single state variable. Now, the thing you might notice is setting state then becomes a little bit more tricky, or you have to be a little bit more conscious of it, right? Because now it's a single state variable. So there's a single instance of set state. And in most cases, you probably will only want to update maybe one piece of the state at a time. And so you'll need to do things like what's here on the slide, right? Which is in this blue, right? Which is set state. You take the previous value, you spread the existing values first. So you kind of cover everything. And then you just individually tweak whichever parts of the state that you want to, right? Based on whatever you're doing at any given point. It's not as clean as probably what you had before, right? But it's a bit of a trade-off. So that's kind of one layer that we can go. But then there's like this final layer, which is what if you also just want to make this setting up state also like a little bit cleaner, right? So you don't have to worry about like managing this huge object all the time in every single situation. And that's where we come to the reducer pattern. And specifically that comes up as a use reducer hook in React. And so the idea of the reducer pattern is just like we are combining all of the values into a single object, let's also combine all of the different actions and updates that we want to make to the state also into a single object, right? Which we're kind of calling the reducer here. And so that sort of really combines everything into one. And so just to put this written down, so you'll notice here on the right-hand side, you still have a single state object. So you preserve sort of that pattern that we had already. You then define a single function that would essentially encapsulate every single possible update that you want to make to the state, right? Typically tied to specific actions in your application that make sense. And then you just set up you use reducer hook, which is this here at the bottom of this arrow, that essentially you pass it these 2 things, which is like, here's my state, and here's also like all the actions I would want to take on this state. And then it just spits out a single state object, and it spits out a single, what we'll call dispatch action, which will allow us to call all these different functions. And then we simply then use this single dispatch function and just specify like, hey, I want to call the increment action to update a specific start state or set loading or whatever, right? So it's simplification then of that layer of state, which is updating the state as well. So that is sort of the logical progression, hopefully, which I tried to lay out here, is like why do we end up landing at the reducer pattern? It's really just in these situations where we have lots of state variables at a single time, and we sort of want to decrease the complexity of management by just reducing everything to a single state and a single way to then update that state across all the variables. So let me pause there. Questions on that and sort of why we care about this reducer pattern. Okay. We're gonna take that as no questions for now. We'll obviously see this in action as well in a little bit here. So that's one type of complexity that we might have to deal with. Let's see. Uh, is Zoom freezing every few seconds? Are other people also having this issue before we proceed?
No, I don't have.
Okay. Okay. Brittany, you might want to try maybe closing and coming back, restarting Zoom. Okay. So this is one direction of complexity that we have to deal with. Now, the second layer is, okay, this is cool. Maybe within the component, I have this very complex amount of state that I'm tracking, but maybe there's elements of that state that I want to actually share with other components, right? So traditionally, what we've seen probably, and as you all have seen, is we use props essentially, right? To pass down, typically in the parent, we have some state. You pass down specific parts of that state to the child through props that it needs to consume, and then it does what it needs to do. That is fine in very simple applications, but you could imagine situations where, hey, I want to get a piece of state from the parent, not just to the child component, but then the child's child component, right? Or maybe like 5 layers down or something. And nothing in the middle needs it. So I'm just passing in the prop as an extra, I'm passing the state through as extra props for the only reason to get it down all the way to the bottom of the tree. And so that's another type of complexity, right? And there's also just a sense of like, I just want to easily be able to share values between different components. And so this is where React context comes in to solve this. Think of it as a global state management of whatever you want. And so now you can just define this state in one place in this global context. And then you wrap the whole component essentially in what's called a context provider. And then automatically your entire application, every component gets access to whatever is sitting in that context, global context automatically. And you can even see here, let me the pen out. So you can see here on the right in this example, right? I have a context provider, which I'm creating and setting up. You can see in this provider, it has its own state. It has its own, even functions here that I'm defining that are tied to that state. And then I am setting this value of the provider to expose essentially all these things. And then in components, there's an additional layer here, which I haven't shown here for simplicity that will to connect this provider up to the application. But then after that, let's say in the child component, like down here, literally all I have to do is say const count equals use context counter context. And now I have access to this count state variable from the top here in this component. And similarly, I can extract out whatever other parts of the context which I exposed, right? Whether it's functions or values or whatever that you want. All good, Brittany. Yeah, if you need to do that, it's totally fine. The recording will speed up shortly after the session, so you'll have access to that. Okay, so let me pause there. Questions on the idea behind context and React context. going to assume no questions for now. So let's keep moving. So okay, so let's look at an example, right? And we'll try to keep this pretty high level. But here's just an example application right now, which is set up as you would probably expect as today. So you can see on the left, there's a single main application. It has a couple pieces of state, has some functions attached to updating that state in some way, and has two children components, which we're passing some props down into. And on the right-hand side, we have these two children components, which are using that parent state in some way, and the same state's probably being used in both children components, and it's doing stuff with that. Okay, so if we think about the reducer and the context, in this situation, how would we, at a high level, like how would we think about using the concepts of reducer and context to refactor this code? Any ideas? It can even just be one piece of it. It doesn't have to be the whole thing.
We can use the context, using a context, and then passing those states, a state value, difficulty, and spawn rate.
Okay, nice. Okay. So yep, so you're saying let's set context to and move the state essentially into context. And why is that useful in this situation?
Because it's passing props. I don't know how to explain in the different
Y-
component.
Yep. Yeah, exactly right. Yeah. The key thing here to look at, right, is that you're consuming this in two different components.
Yeah.
So exactly as you were saying, and so that's why we think about moving this into context. I think the other right, I think to be very clear as well, right, about this is, I mean, inherently reducers and context do add additional complexity, right, to your application because it's an additional layer. So you should not walk out of this session or this week's assignments thinking, oh, I should only use reducer and context now in the future. What you should be thinking about is what are the situations where it's appropriate to use reducer or context versus just good old state, right? Because like in this example, if I was only using difficulty here in only one of the two components, I would just leave it as is, right? As a simple state, just easier to manage. So yes, but in this case, we have, as you were saying, two different uses of it in different components. Sure, why don't we throw that into a context? All right, so that's context. I feel pretty good about that. What about reducer? How would we go about using reducer here? And why would we think about using reducer? Any ideas? Okay, let's start with a simpler question. Why would we think about using reducer in this setup in the first place? Let's ignore context for now, right? Like, okay, we talked about context. Let's put that to the side. If we were just staring at this code as is, why would we think about using the reducer here?
To avoid like a repetitive using a state.
Yep, exactly. Right. Yep. So that's a good start. So we have use state, and in this case, we have two different use states. And so that's maybe why we would think about using it. I would say this is a very aggressive use of reducer, but let's just assume we'll do it. So, okay, let's say okay, we're going to use reducer because we have two different state variables and want to combine them. So then what do we need to make sure that we do in the reducer? Just with the code here. What do we need to make sure we transfer over to the reducer? And as a hint, I will broadly box the things that you should be focusing on.
Difficulty and set difficulty state and handle set difficulty.
Yep, exactly. So if we're going to, we have to make sure that we think about with the reducer, we think about moving the state itself over to the reducer, but then also what actions would we want to take on that state to update that state. So in this case, handle set difficulty, which is a place where we are calling right now the setters for the state. So we need to make sure we essentially move this logic itself into the reducer directly. Okay, let me click over. I think I have a sample solution here. Yeah, so here's just to get you a sense, right? So on the left here is an example piece of context I've set up. And inside this context, I have put the reducer in. I think that's the other thing I want to call out here with this example is the context, think of it as like a container for whatever other stuff you want to put in. You can put like, you can obviously put state in there. Because you can put state, you can also put reducers in there, right? So you can see, I just highlight this. You can see in the provider, I have set up a use reducer inside of this provider. So now, and then what I'm doing is I'm setting this state and dispatch I'm getting from reducer as values in the provider. And so now these become exposed to everything in the application. So I've essentially exposed this reducer setup to everything in the application. And this is why I can set up and move, for example, that function we had for updating the difficulty. I move that up into the reducer itself because this is an action I can take. And obviously then this state as well is moved into that as well. And as I said, in this context provider, you can put in state, you can put in reducers, you can throw in use effects for things that you care about for that state that you're throwing in there. You can really throw anything into that. It's really ends up being just another component that just gives you that is globally accessible. If component could be gross. Do you want to say more, Anna, on that?
I mean, if you will have more cases, it will be better that you have a reducer.
Yes. Yes. That is also very true. So I would at a high level say in this specific example, like if this was actually something I was working on, I would not employ a reducer here because it is to your, as you were saying, like relatively simplistic. So I would have just probably, I mean, again, there's only two pieces of state. I would have probably just thrown the state into the context, and then if I wanted to, I could have also moved the what function it was called before. This like handle set difficulty thing. I will just move that function into the whole function. I would just copy and paste it into the context and then exposed it. Because yes, I agree. I think right now it's like not super worth it as it is. Great. I think the other thing I would just say though is sort of the nice part of this, especially when you get into more complex situations, is now you can see, okay, on the left-hand side, I've set up the context, the reducer. On the right-hand side, I don't know about you, but I think the code on the right-hand side now looks a lot more clean and readable because it's just very declarative in terms of what's going on, right? So the main application now, we essentially clear out all the state and everything, and it's just like, okay, we have a provider that wraps everything, and then we have our two children components. That's very easy to read. And now in the children components, there's no props I need to drill down to, so I can just take out the state that I care about and still, everything else here, I just have to swap in the state. That's cool and easy. And then the only other thing is out now for this function here, instead of having to define the function and the component, I can just call it here in the onClick, dispatch, pass in what type of action I'm specifically doing here, which is in this case, the set difficulty. And if I need to pass additional props to that function, easy enough, we can pass it through. So it does become much cleaner now to read the components themselves because we've kind of abstracted a lot of this logic out. Again, this has more benefits when you have more complex things. Again, this specific situation, you can argue like we just moved the complexity from one place to another. So like, was it really worth it? But that is sort of the benefits that you will start to see in more scalable situations. All right, questions on context, producer, conceptually at a high level before we actually start trying to employ some of this ourselves. Okay, so then let's switch over to the code base. All right, so here I have pulled up our good old React blog that we've been working on from the last few weeks. So let's start to think about how we might use context and reducers in this case. I think let's start with context because I think that's like a little bit easier to start sorting through. So let me just pull up and remind you kind of the way the app is structured now. And then we'd love to hear some ideas on like what do we think could be candidates for things we might want to move into some sort of global context. So as a reminder, we have the main application here. We have a couple pieces of state for articles and for search values. We're fetching the data here in the component, also keeping track of the sorting, keep track of how we change that. And the UI, we have some different components here. Then we have this article list component where we're giving it the list of articles. If we go into article list, we're taking those articles, we're doing stuff with it, displaying them. And then we have a further article card component, right, where we're passing in each article. So based on that structure, let's just throw out some ideas. Like what do we think, like one, would context be useful here? And then second, what sorts of things would we want to try to move into the context?
I think passing the article's value to each component using the context.
Yep. So I think that's a great start. Like we are clearly passing down article data down into the components. And so that's a great option for pulling it up into context. I agree with that. What about anything else that we think might be useful? Yeah, you can say the answer is no. I want to see how you all are thinking about this though. Like, is there anything else that we might want to pull up besides the article data? Okay, so I'm going to take that as maybe there isn't anything else. And I would say, based on my perspective, I would agree that the main thing I think to pull up is the article data in this case, at least from where it is right now. So let's actually start with that. So I have gone ahead and started the file for the context. So what I typically like to do is I like to throw these different. Now, the other thing I should keep in mind, right, is you can have multiple different providers that are there simultaneously in an application, which is actually really good from an organization perspective. So, for example, what I'm doing here is I've created a provider for one piece of context that I'm calling the article data provider, right? So everything related to article data is going to be included in this context. Now, if I wanted to add other things in the context, I could create a separate provider for that, and I can stack these providers on top of each other. So that's just a really good organizational tool to have. So you're not just throwing every single piece of state you have in your application that you want to share right in one place. But here, let's just start with article data. So I've just done the simple scaffolding because there's a bit of code here to write. Take some time. So just to walk through this, what I'm doing is I'm first creating the context itself from this create context function, which comes from React directly, calling this article data context. Let's skip the state and reducer for now because we'll come back to that. And then I've set up the provider of this context, which is pretty simple structure. It's a function that you export. It takes in children, and it just returns the children wrapped in the context is provider that we can access like this. And then we just need to make sure we expose what values we want to all the things in the application. And then finally, something I like to do as well as a helper is I set up this helper function here called, you can think of it as a helper hook that we're creating called use article data. So now wherever I want to use this data, I can just call use article data without having to call normally you would call like use context and then pass in this context object. This just makes it a little bit nicer to use this context. We'll see that here shortly. Okay, questions about the setup of this context? Again, this is, I would say, pretty standard, just how you would set up any piece of context. Okay, so let's just start moving things into context. And again, the beautiful thing is this is like a React component. So you can actually do a lot of just do a little copy pasting here. So let's go into our app. And let's say that we want to definitely move in. I would say we should move in probably both this all articles data. If you remember, this is like the full data set of articles. And then this other articles object was what we're actually displaying out, right? Based on search and whatever other things that we have, right? So let's, I would say, let's first move in this all articles maybe first into it. That just might be easier to start with. So I'm just literally just going to cut this piece of state. I'm going to move it into this provider here at the top. And I need to import useState. Okay. Now, importantly, I need to expose these things, right? So let me just add it here as a value. Now, let's just forget the reducer for now. So in this case, if I didn't use reducer, right? In some cases, I probably would need to expose both the value of all articles and probably also the setter in reality, right? Because probably some place that we want to set this all articles value potentially, we would need to expose it directly in the context. But let's see, maybe we won't need to. So let's go ahead and do that. Now, as I said, this is just a component. So the other thing I'm going to do is let's just take a look, right? Like where are we calling set all articles? Well, if I'm just looking at all this, we're really only calling the setter when we're doing this fetch, right? When we're fetching the data and then we set this data, right, on the state. So in this case, what I would do is I would say, you know what? Let's just move the data fetching into the context as well, because it's just another component. So I'm going to move this fetch articles function and the use effect where we call it. And I'm just going to take this. I'm going to cut it and move it just as is into the provider. And I need to import use effect. Okay, so now we have this provider, this context provider that's going to mount. And when it mounts, it's going to create the state. It's going to then, on the mounting of this provider component, we'll call fetch articles, which is our good old data fetching. And we'll do all this stuff. It'll update the state, and it'll all just work. Now, in this case, because I'm not really going to need to use set all articles anywhere else, I can just remove it here from the exposing it in the context, because why would I kind of expose that unnecessarily? So you can see this really is like an exercise of like copy pasting actually, which is really cool. Questions on just that, what I just did? Okay, so let's keep going. So next, we'll notice there's errors because we're trying to now access this all articles object that no longer exists in this component. So we need to bring it in. So the way we're going to do that, right, is we're going to use this helper hook that I create, right? Use article data. And so if I go here, I could say now all articles, I'm going to destructure this out from use article data, just like that. And so now we have access just like that to all articles. And so all of our references now here at all articles are tied to that shared state in the provider. Okay, I hit save. There's an error here. Why? Why is there an error? So we want to take a stab at why we think there's an error here.
So because the file is JS file instead of JSX?
Yep, that's right. Just as the error here is telling us, right? So again, as I've been mentioning, you should treat this provider as just another component. And so because it's another component, we're still using JSX here in the return statement. So in this case, I purposefully only call this JS. So we need to make this a JSX file. Okay, that's cool. So now let's refresh the page. Okay. It seems to be, let me restart this server. Let's see if it's going to give an error. Okay, so there's no clear error right now. Let me check the inspect. Okay, so you can see it's not working still. And you can see here there's an error here. cannot destructure properly all articles of use article data as is undefined. Does anyone want to take a guess as why that error is happening? Just as a reminder, it is essentially saying this line is erroring out when we're trying to get this all articles.
I'm not sure this is the answer, but we might not need the curly braces for the all articles because it's already exported. I don't know.
So that's a good thought. So we are actually okay with the curly braces here because you'll notice actually if we didn't need the curly braces, I think our code editor would probably tell us, right? There'll be a red line here probably saying like, what are you doing? But this is actually needed because if you just go back here, the value that we're setting is an object,
Yeah.
and this
Oh,
object has properties. So actually that's actually
right. Yeah.
good. But that's a good thought. Any other ideas? Just as to start guiding us in the right direction. Think about like we have this data provider. Are we using this data provider anywhere right now? Okay, so let's talk through this then in terms of what's going on here. So the issue is I have created this provider with all this wonderful stuff inside of it, but I haven't actually used this provider anywhere, right? Like all I did was create this file. I haven't touched any other files. I haven't referenced this data provider anywhere where all this stuff lives. So what we need to do is we need to make sure we wrap the application in the provider so that it actually gets created. So here I will do this probably in, yep, main.jsx. I'll wrap the whole app in this. I'll call it article data provider. And I'll just wrap the application in it. And so now you can see already the application is loaded here. Now we have an instance of data provider. And because we have an instance of it, it has created the all articles state object. It's loaded the data in, it's passing it through. And so now in app.jsx, I can now actually access all articles because it's defined now. And now app is working as before. So this is just meant to be a good reminder that you have to remember to wrap the application in the provider. Only then can you actually have an instance to refer to for all the values inside the provider.
Excuse me, could you please return? I would like to see the errors again. What errors talk?
Yes. So if I remove
Just good.
this, and so the first thing is you're not going to see, so in the terminal, there's no errors. It's just a blank white screen. But if I go into the console, and if I can make this a little bit bigger, so this is the error. Uncaught type error cannot destructure properly all articles of use article data as it is undefined. And so that is referring to, this error is referring to this line 10. And essentially it's saying it's undefined. All articles is not defined anywhere.
And after you understand that this is undefined, you should go to app.js. When you find some errors, I would like to know the logic, what I should do. Like now you understand this is line 10, and then
Yep.
you go to app JSX.
Yeah. So the way I would probably just like think through this, right, is so one is okay, the error itself is saying this error is throwing at app.js x line 10. That's great. So that's this line. It's telling us that all articles is not defined, right? It's undefined. So I say, okay, why is that not defined? So let me go and look at where it's defined, right? Which would be, okay, let me click through the use article data, which is here. Okay, setting up the context. So I know all articles is sitting here in the provider. So then I would sit there and think, why is this not defined? Right? And so well, you might just directly say, oh, it's not defined because I forgot to create an instance of the provider. If you're really not sure, then one simple thing you could do is like say, let's just go to console log, right? And say like started provider with articles and then like pass all articles, right? So this should log out something and then the current value of all articles, right? To see what's going on if you didn't really know what was going on. So then if I like refresh this again, you would still, well, I think you would see like it's not actually console logging anything, right? So then that should tell you that, well, I'm not even getting to this console log. So why am I not getting to that console log? Oh, it's because I like never even like created an instance of this thing. And that's when you would say, oh yes, I need to now remember to go and add this provider in here. And now when I save it, it's working. It's that console log statement that we were talking about is not working, right? And spitting it out. So now everything is working as expected. So that's in a generic debug situation, like that would be the process I would go through.
Thank you. Thank you for explanation.
Yeah. Yeah. When in doubt, just start throwing a bunch of console logs all over the place. I think it's the simplest thing. People will try to teach you about all these like complex debugging techniques, and then you'd be shocked how many people who've been doing this for decades still just resort to console logs or print statements or whatever, depending on the language. So always feel free to fall back on that. Okay, so I just want to take a step back, right? What we've done is we've essentially said, I'm going to take this logic of all the articles and even the fetching of the articles and the use effect for that, and I moved it into a provider. And so now I've moved it completely outside the app.jsx file altogether. There's now like nothing in here about data fetching or anything. I moved it out into the provider, and now I can access this article data here once. And hopefully, as you can see, also like it was just a lot of straight copy paste, which is really nice. Okay, so this is one version of it. But as we were saying earlier, actually what is being passed down into the articles is what articles do we want to actually be showing, right? And right now, the context is not doing that, right? Essentially, all we've done is move data fetching into the provider, which might have its own merits or benefits, but actually doesn't get at like what we're trying to get to in the first place. So to really do this, we would need to also move this piece of state as well into the context, right? Which is what are the articles I actually want to display? So let's just move that over as well. So I'm just gonna take this, move the articles over here, and let's just add this here. This is the state. Let us expose this. We need to expose probably articles here. And then let's see if we need to expose set articles. Probably will need to. Let's take a look and see. I'll go here. Okay, now I need to instead also extract articles. So I've called it. Okay, it seems like set articles also we would need in this situation. So let's expose that as well, the setter for this state. So we have access to it in this component. Set articles. Okay, so we've moved now that into that. And great. It should just work as is. I refresh the page, I start searching. Okay, so everything is working as expected. We just moved another piece of state. But now let's actually make use of this to get rid of this prop drilling, right? So now all I need to do is, because now the state lives up in the context, I can move this prop from article list. Let me go into article list. I don't need to pass this in as a prop, but instead I can just go back and let me just copy how I got it here and just add it here. Don't need these other two. Import article data. Use article data. There we go. And now, there we go. We got rid of the prop. We bypassed the props altogether. And now we're just directly accessing which articles we need to show in the article list from the context. And because we're now passing through the articles to show, things like search and stuff are still working as expected because we're still directly accessing that state and updating search and everything like that directly into that shared state. So this is where we start to see the power of this shared state come about. So questions on everything we just did? Okay. So we set up the context, we move a couple of things in the context. That's great. Now, something you might notice here, which I personally find kind of annoying, is we need to expose both the value of the state itself and the setters as well, because we actually want to update the state in some way elsewhere, right? And you can imagine right now we just have a couple pieces of state, but the idea of this data provider is to bring all the pieces of state we care about globally into this one area. And we would just need to expose all those pieces of state plus all those setters everywhere, right? Which at some point becomes a bit unwieldy. And so this is where we might say, again, maybe in this situation it's simple enough, but we might say, let's actually move this over to a reducer setup instead of individual pieces of state to manage all this. So let's go ahead and set that up. So here I have this scaffolded out, right? Like here would be, we'd set some initial state, we'd set up this reducer that takes a state and an action, and then based on the action's type, we'll do different things to it. So let's go ahead and set this up, right? So, okay, what would we probably care about here? In this case, I would definitely care about the articles. So I'm going to move this state variable essentially up here. By default, this will be empty as we had down here. You might care about also moving just all articles as well into this, which is totally fine. Now, you can also choose maybe to say, I'm going to include certain things in the reducer and not exclude things, and exclude certain other things. That will be up to you. But for now, let's just throw everything in. Now, I would argue also, in this case, if I go back into the app, I would say, let's also move search as well into this object, because we can end up combining all this logic, because this will influence what the article list that we want to show. It might just be a little bit cleaner just to move everything into this single state that we can handle it all together. So I will make the choice to move this out as well into the context and then also into this initial state. So I'll call it search value. Again, I'm just like essentially copying and pasting what we had before for now. And so then based off of all this, I can now say const, and the two returns, right, are state and dispatch, our use reducer, and we got to pass in the reducer, which we need to update, and then the initial state. And then we would expose here now state and the dispatch. So I'm just go ahead and essentially migrate this over from using state to using a reducer pattern. Okay, well, the first thing we will notice is we already have an error here, which is we need to update all articles to this article data. So how is that going to work? So in this reducer pattern, how would we set this up?
Using a dispatch function.
Yep, exactly. So this is where dispatch comes in. So we need to update this reducer to accept some sort of new action type. Let's call this, I'll maybe just call it like initial load. And this will need to take some sort of payload as well with the data. And what I would do here is I would just, again, what we want to do essentially is we need to return the new state. That's what the reducer is going to do, is it's going to return what's the updated state after this action. And what I would return here, right, is I would just take the existing state, and I just need to update all the articles in this case, right? We're just going to scope it to the initial load, and I would attach the action dot payload to this. And we would need to attach a payload essentially to this action. And then to use this, I would replace the set all articles now with calling this instead. So we have this dispatch already defined up here. So I'll call dispatch. I need to pass in the type, which is going to be this initial load. And on the payload, I'm just going to pass in this case, the payload is the new value to set. So I'm just going to pass in this article data, get rid of this. So this is our new way of setting the state. If I refresh this, it probably won't work. There's a reason for that. Let's just fix some other errors that are showing up here. So now the values that we're exposing, right, are the state and the dispatch. Now, something that I might do here is instead of exposing the entire state here, I might expose pieces of that state. So for example, I might say, I want to expose articles, which is state.articles, right? Like maybe that's what I start to care about, right? Is individual pieces of the state to actually expose out. Now, there's still errors here because if I go here, okay, we have errors about search value and stuff. So let me fix this. So let's just expose also out I can move this over. Come on. There we go. Okay, let's say I also expose the search value, state dot search value. We need to move some of this stuff over just for now. And then I might just expose search value from this. Oops. Okay. Some of these other things don't exist anymore. Okay. And you can start to see now there's like even more complexity here because now there's like a lot of other things that it doesn't want. So when I see things like this, when I'm using a context, I'm like, clearly these things need to be passed through. You know what? I'm just going to update this by just moving a bunch of this stuff out into, I'm just literally just going to take all this, I'm going to cut it, and we're just going to move it out into the context. So let's do this. I'm also going to move this sort order here as well, because we'll need to do that. Now, if I move this into this, go here, and move this old state, we don't need anymore. And I might start going just a little bit quicker here, so we make sure we cover this. But I just kind of walk through how we think about doing all these changes, and there are changes to be made. So we would say, okay, well, what needs to happen? Well, there's this other piece of state that we have here. Just for simplicity here, let's just also move this into the reducer. The sort order initially is ascending. You don't need this anymore. Now, everywhere there's a setter, we need to make sure we update that. First, let's update where there's just the state. So here I have state, so I can just replace these with state.sortOrder now, because it's now property of state. I can do that here for all articles, state.allArticles, state.searchValue. Okay, so most of these errors are done. We don't need to expose, we do need to expose the search value actually. So, and we also need to expose probably sort order as well. Okay. And then you would say, okay, this would be state.searchValue, state.allArticles. Okay, now we don't know where these setters are. So we need to probably process this change. The way I would do this here, again, for simplicity, is let's just essentially make versions of the setters here in the reducer. That would say case, maybe say update articles, right? And I would just return here the existing state, and I would update articles to be whatever the payload is that I'm passing. This is a very simplistic way to do this, right? And so now this gets replaced with dispatch type is update articles, payload is sorted articles. That replaces that. And then this one down here can also get replaced with filtered articles instead. This will be a state.articles. And for sort order, again, the simplistic thing here would be case, update, sort, order, state, and then update the sort order to whatever the payload is. And then this just becomes, I just copy this, and then move some things around. Oops. That becomes the payload. Need to change this to update that. And then there we go. Okay, so now you might actually notice that, oh, Pando sort change is not called anywhere because this is what we were using actually to control some of the search inputs. So this is a situation where I would say, actually, this actually should be co-located with the app, right? Because this is logic that's tied to the UI. So let me just move this back over, but we've already updated all the references here so that this should work as is. Okay, and we need to make sure we pull dispatch from the context. Okay, we need the sort order as well. So then we can move this to sort order. Articles will be here. Move this. Okay, now we're starting to get somewhere. And then there's finally this set search value that we need to update, right? Which is as we type things in, we need to update search value. So again, this is an example where we would need another dispatch option, right? Which is case update search value, return state search value is action.payload. So then now here, I would change this to say dispatch type is update search value, payload is this thing that we had before. Okay, now one more error here somewhere. Let's see what this error is. Okay, that's down there. Okay, this is fine. Okay, so after a lot of back and forth, let's just try it, right? We have data, it still loads in as expected. If I try searching, so everything is working as expected, but you can see I have to kind of reconnect a bunch of things up with this new reducer path. But I end up getting the same behavior as before. Just need to update the way I sort of write some of these things. Okay, let me pause there because I just did a lot and then we're also at time. So questions on anything I just did? I know I went a little bit quick, so happy to also just like re-talk through what I just did. Yes, this is very different ways of thinking about things. I think for me, my hope is the context should hopefully be a little bit more straightforward to understand in terms of just like we're just moving stuff essentially into a global location. The reducer pattern is different. I will definitely say that. Yes, I think rewatching is a good call. Um, yeah, reducer is yes. This is hopefully this should also maybe start to show you like it is important to be like to think clearly about like when is the right places to use this. Because like I'll just be honest myself, right? Like I use context a lot because it's very useful in terms of just moving things. I haven't used reducer a ton personally because I just haven't gotten to a point where I'm like, this thing is complex enough that I'd rather set the reducer stuff versus just managing different state, right? So it's one of those things where it's you should be aware of it. You should sit down and try to understand it, right? To know how to implement it. But also at the end of the day, you will, in a real life situation, you'll be able to make a call, right? It's like, is it actually worth it to use the reducer here or not? But it can be a very powerful setup when things get very, very complex. So definitely, yeah, if there's specific things you want me to like just talk through again right now, happy to do that. But then also obviously the recording is there, to talk through as well. Yeah, I would say so. So question here is like how common are these? I would say the concept of context is very common because it's really global state, right? And there's a lot of situations where global state becomes very useful. So like a very, very simple example of a common use of context is let's say you have a website and you want to support a dark mode and a light mode. So typically the way you would set that up is you want that's a kind of global piece of information that you want everything to be aware of, right? So the way you would typically set that up is you would have that configuration stored in a global context where you can read that context whenever you want. And also you can set that context as well. Let's say you have a toggle somewhere to toggle between light and dark mode. You have that live in the context and then kind of work with it there. So context is very useful and common, I would say. I would say the reducer pattern is less common because it's one of those things where you only use it if you really need it, right? So, like in this situation, as it is, would I really have used a reducer for this level of complexity? Like, probably not, right? Like all the work I just did, like I probably would not, I would probably say like this is probably not worth it for this level of complexity, right? I think the context for sure is useful because, you know, you could imagine, and this was if we had more time today, I would have done this where we say, okay, now the article data is now global. So let's say, for example, I wanted to have some sort of box somewhere where I want to show like how many articles do I have in the data set. Now that data lives universally in the global context. So I could just access that from this new component and just grab articles.length and be done. Right? I don't have to worry about like trying to shuffle the article data around through props or what, like it's just available. So context is very useful, is what I would say for sure. Yeah. Again, I think I would, yeah, I think from a practical perspective, like context is very, very useful. Reducer is like more targeted. But I will say the reducer pattern I will also just say like the reducer pattern as a whole is not specific to React. It is a type of pattern that exists in kind of system architecture. So it is a good idea to try to get your head around like sort of why do we use it and how do we set it up? Because actually as a contract and a concept, it is actually kind of interesting and can be very useful in certain situations. Like another thing I would just call out, right? Which like we didn't really explicitly talk about is I kind of touched on it, right? Which is so normally when you use a state variable, right? And you want to, let's say in a child component, you want to update that state variable. We have to expose both the state itself, but also the setter of that state directly. And you might argue that by doing so, you're sort of exposing that setter function globally. And so theoretically, some other component, you could accidentally like pull that setter in and like accidentally update the state from some other component that you didn't mean to do that, right? And so what the reducer pattern can do, one of the other benefits of it actually, is that it sort of hides away that detail, right? Like you don't directly expose anymore the actual setter. You expose specific actions that other components can call on. Now, in the back end, like it effectively is doing the setting, but you get to control essentially what exactly you're exposing now. So that's another sort of like hidden benefit of sort of the React of the reducer kind of concept and setup. So yeah, this is all to say like reducer is definitely the more kind of complex thing, I would say for sure for things for this week. But try to take the time to really understand just how it is set up and how to work with it because it can come in handy. But definitely like context is like way more practically useful for sure.